Thank you for being with us. Pete, I'll start with you. Tell me your thoughts. Obviously, it's so evident names like Zoom have killed it, though it had some volatility recently. What are your thoughts on some of these tech names?
Well, I think virtually all of them stand to benefit in this crisis. I mean, their services are getting leaned on more and more, and they're largely delivering. Over the last decade, things like video chat, things like cloud services, work from home, remote work software, all of that's been battle hardened, improved, optimized to the point where it just works. I mean, there's been so much distance learning, for example, that's going on now over Google Classroom and other platforms that it's really impressive. There hasn't been really any widespread reports of glitches or outages. I mean, certainly there's been some strain on networks and individual things going on, but it's largely working. So all of these stocks are standing to benefit, though probably a few more than others.
Right. And Scott, what are your thoughts?
Well, thanks a lot for having me. I guess a couple things come to mind. There's no question that a lot of companies are providing software and services enabling people to work from home and learn from home. And I think that's great. I think what we're seeing is, the load essentially being placed on networks and connectivity and infrastructure at unprecedented levels. And so what we're seeing is, very large companies are for the most part doing a good job. Nicole, you referenced Zoom, for example. I think a lot of people at the beginning of the year had never even heard of Zoom, particularly from a consumption or user perspective. I guess somewhat quietly, the company now has become, I think, a top 10 technology software company by market cap. It's ahead of names like Autodesk and Workday. And what I would say about certain other types of names, like an Autodesk, for example, is that that's a name that frankly is very vulnerable to, we think, based on conversations that we've had with industry experts, to an economic slowdown. And so I think that's something to be mindful of as well. It's not just every company provides technology and is benefiting. I think not only are there kind of winners and losers, but there are actually parts of the same company's businesses that are doing well and some that are being adversely affected as well.
Right, understood.
Yeah.
Pete, what are you hearing about, you can comment on what Scott had to say, but I also, as everybody's working from home, so far everything's working in our world. I have this sort of fear. What if tech breaks down in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's still the chance of that as we continue to strain these systems. But largely, I think that the crisis gradually creeped up on us, and then suddenly, was suddenly everywhere. But I mean, I think there was a lot of lead up that let people sort of back their systems. These companies make sure they have the right servers and the loads, and they're constantly working to improve them.
Right.
To respond a little bit to what Scott said, yeah, he's absolutely right. Companies, some aspects of some companies are going to do super well, and maybe others not so well. Facebook is a great example because we're straining their systems. I mean, we're demanding more from their systems. They're largely delivering, which is good, right? That's better, more activity, more engagement on the platform. But the problem is, there's a lot of that's an advertising dependent company, and there's a lot of people in this now, in this economy are now pulling back their ad spend, especially small and medium business, which is the backbone of that revenue stream. So this may not turn out that well for Facebook in the long term, even though we're demanding more of their services.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, ads are a big part of it. And, a lot of the ads came from the travel sector, right? From cruise ships and airlines and great trips. And, those particular companies are suffering. They may not have as much as ad money to spend. Scott, tell me about some of the names that pre-announced early, right? Apple and Microsoft. Those were some of the names that warned early, but people are using Microsoft Skype as something that they're using from home. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think what's interesting is that Apple and Microsoft negatively pre-announced pretty early on, and that's because they have exposure to the supply chain that's primarily centered in and around Asia. And so we've seen that impact. It seems to me like we see Asia coming back online slowly, but now the other issue is from a demand perspective, where many of us in the Western world are dealing with circumstances that weren't anticipated, weeks ago, frankly. So what I would say is that, you look at, and I think the point that was made about Facebook is interesting, because Twitter, as much as they might be seeing increasing traffic and engagement, they had to pull their guidance to a large extent because, frankly, of the impact of the coronavirus. And so another example is a company that we had a conversation about relatively recently, Procore, which is looking to go public. They filed a registration statement at the end of February. It's a leader in construction management software, and they're heavily exposed to a decline in, let's call it, construction volume, because that largely dictates the revenue that they're able to generate. Without any projects, without any activity, we think that based on conversations that we've had, that is a company that could be vulnerable. So what I would say in conclusion is, if you look at the big cloud providers like AWS, like Microsoft Azure, like Google Cloud, sure, they're all benefiting from the perspective that a lot more people are relying on their networks and their infrastructure to receive content and applications as well as use them. But on the flip side, you'd have to think that, there's less kind of growth, maybe absent growth, maybe even negative growth in the economies around the world, and that can't be good for business from that perspective.
And Pete, last thought, I got less than a minute left.
It's going to go back to normal at some point. The crisis, God willing, will eventually pass. And, I think then there'll be much clearer who the winners and losers are. I'm actually pretty bullish on Microsoft and Google coming out of this with better in the long term, because the whole culture is starting to change in terms of what is the possibility of working from home in my company, in my industry. And maybe after this is passed, we should rethink some of these things and just turn to people coming into an office and turn to software platforms. And Google and Microsoft have really good systems for that and good solutions and business models that are already working around that. So I see them as sort of the two big winners of the sort of FANG group.